The idea of humanoid creatures or anthropomorphic deities is not entirely unheard of. You will come across anthropomorphic illustrations and tales of such entities across cultures and civilizations. Myths and lores abound as we migrate, grow, and prosper beyond our cognitive bias. Therefore, beliefs and sometimes reason are thrust into a domain or a realm where every claim that we have held onto falls apart before we can so much as react, like a cry for help or a response to a threat, or indulge our senses a little further, hoping for a grand revelation, a possible breakthrough in the grand narrative of humanity. That is how myths are born and discoveries are made. Today, we are going to be talking about one such discovery that found its way across the pages of history and the accounts of Greeks, Romans, Arabian folktales, medieval bestiaries, and travelogues of famous travelers from different parts of the world. We are talking about the Cynocephalics, the race of dog-headed humanoids that were believed to inhabit other parts of the world and on occasion proactively partook in reshaping the history of mankind. So who were these creatures? What were they like? How closely did they resemble us? Are we looking at a missing link in the history of evolution? Questions beget questions, but fret not, for we are not playing fetch in the dark here. I've got you covered. So without wasting another moment, the dice we have rolled have led us here to dive right into the fascinating history of the Cynocephalics. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you, and let's begin. What are cynocephalics? These are creatures that appear to be part human and part dog, or in some instances, a jackal. Anatomically, as far as mythological retellings are concerned, the entire body from below the head is in the likeness of a man or Homo sapiens, whilst the head is the only part that appears to be a projection of a canine. The characteristics are, of course, subject to modifications with changing contexts and varying receptions and depictions as found in different cultures. Cynocephalics, a derivative of the noun cynocephaly, which literally means dog-headness. The word is taken from Latin, which in turn has roots in the Greek word kynocephaloi. Now, whether this refers to a more symbolic connotation or an idiosyncratic metaphor hinting at a behavioral trait or a pattern is for you to decide. However, what this does suggest, and can be effectively concluded, is that it confirms as it refers to the presence of a dog head over a human body. Legends of these dog-headed humans are found in many parts of the world, such as ancient Egypt, Greece, India, and China. We have also mentioned them in extensive detail during the medieval era as well, both across the East and the West. It must be borne in mind that while they may exhibit features akin to that of a wolfman or lycanthropes that we are familiar with, but in truth and in essence, the two are nothing alike. While the cynocephalus are canids, it is their actual state of being, and they have developed and devised communications as such, analogous to humans, and can talk and speak in tongues, albeit incoherent and too primitive, nonetheless discernible and familiar to us. Cynocephalics in ancient mythologies. The earliest known reportage, as it seems, was that of Ctesias, a Greek historian from around 500 BC. His claim was that there lived a race of dog-headed humans in the distant land of India who were covered in black hair all over their body, with necks bearing a resemblance to that of a horse, and quite appropriately, he labeled them as cynocephali, or dog-heads. It was the first of many different compilations to have covered extensively the life, dietary customs, and even the military prowess of these creatures. While it is difficult to surmise aspects and features that were unique to them due to recurrent narratives, each divergent from the other, that have sprung forth through the ages. However, one thing is for certain: the belief in the existence of these creatures has been evident for the most part. But he wasn't the only Greek to have laid claims on the existence of these dog-headed men. Prominent figures like Megasthenes, Herodotus, and even Alexander the Great spoke of such sightings. Most of their accounts situate them in India, except Herodotus, who claimed that the existence of cynocephalics was not confined to the lands of India. His reports mention claims made by ancient Libyans who believed that these creatures were quite widespread across Asia, and that the dog-headed men were just one among many anomalies who walked the earth. They even spoke of the headless men. The Romans too offered a picturesque insight into their lives. However, they situated them in Africa. Could they perhaps be the same dog-headed men that walk Egypt as gods? I mean, yes, one can't help but wonder about the possibility. The Egyptian god Anubis, the god of death and the underworld, an iconographic figure in the ancient Egyptian pantheon, perfectly matches the profile of the dog-headed Cynocephalics. They were the most pristine of creatures, revered and feared for their wisdom and knowledge of the world and beyond. Mystifying as they may be, they were considered noble beings who neither harbored nor exhibited animosity towards fellow humans. However, that perception changed with the advent of the medieval era. Cynocephalics in other historical accounts. Meanwhile, the Greeks and Romans did not exactly paint a picture of a sophisticated species of humanoid men. Their Cynocephalics lived more like a tribe of hunter-gatherers. Megasthenes believed that they communicated through barking and were clad in the skin of wild beasts. However, they did possess an understanding of the native tongue spoken by nearby Indians. However, close to the end of antiquity, the perception of these creatures as peaceful, noble groups changed. Travelers and writers spoke of bearing witness to unspeakable horrors and savagery when they came across these humanoids. As civilizations continued to flourish through the medieval times, their depictions became frequent and more often than not, quite gruesome and fierce. For instance, travelers like Marco Polo and Giovanni del Carpine both attest to the existence of a race of dogheads that the armies of Ogedei Khan encountered. They were said to inhabit the region to the north of Delir Nor or Lake Baikal. The travels of Marco Polo detail dog-headed barbarians on the island of Agamane, or the Andaman Islands. According to him, these people were utterly ruthless and cunning. They grew spices and were as big mastiff dogs. Sir John Mandeville also spoke of these men inhabiting the Nicobar Islands in his travelogue. The medieval era, whilst marked by the spirit of exploration and learning, which was due in part to religious excursions made by traveling saints and monks to spread the word of God, was also an age of fear and reckon, or at least, that is what the belief was. This was reflected in maritime maps, where the edges often featured monstrous entities and creatures. So, it is quite probable the accounts of the dog-headed men were not fables or lores, but a certainty written with conviction against disbelief. Cynocephalics in religious contexts. Medieval bestiaries featured hordes of terrifying monsters and beings dwelling in exotic new lands far from civilization and kingdoms. These creatures were often unintelligent and ungodly, acted out of spite or rage, and harbored nothing but malefic schemes to satiate their bloodlust. It is also important to note that it was a period that marked the rise of Abrahamic faiths like Christianity and Islam. Monks, travelers, and saints from missionaries and convents believed in the call of God, and they were but intermediaries who could merely respond by spreading the word of the divine will and converting those who were oblivious to his will. So, faith had a role to play in the way history and other literary sources were drafted and imagined at the time. The question of whether cynocephaly and other phantasmagoric creatures existed or not intrigued several Christian authors like St. Augustine of Hippo. He argued that humans, as they are descendants of Adam. Now, this was important because if these races of beastmen, or the dog-headed men as they were, are to be considered descendants of the first man, they must be made aware of the Gospels and must be taught in the ways of Christianity to have their souls redeemed in the afterlife. However, there were many like the St. Augustine of Hippo who rejected such claims made on the possibility of the existence of these creatures, or even if he didn't regard them as humans but as animals and, therefore, beyond saving. One of the most pronounced examples in this tradition was the conversion of St. Christopher, which we will discuss in detail in a minute. On a similar plane, writers from the Islamic world also cited the existence of these beings in the accounts of the Moorish traveler Ibn Battuta, who describes his encounter with the dog-mouthed men inhabiting the land of Baranakar. There's a good chance that he may have come across a tribal group called Mentawai on the islands between Sumatra and India. They are known for their bizarre rituals and the practice of tooth sharpening. He describes them as a vile race that has no religion and practicing polygyny. However, what's interesting here is that the females would appear human and were quite graceful and exquisite. Authors like Alexander stated that they would abduct human females to mate with them. Cynocephalics in medieval Europe. The lore of cynocephalics reached Europe more as a cautionary tale of a savage race of heathens who had no qualms or restraint in their dietary choices and societal customs. These dog-headed men were cannibalistic predators who exhibited a carnivorous urge to prey and hound as apex predators do, and would not budge or miss the chance to devour and feast when there was a human in sight. However, a significant change that can be observed in the narratives of medieval Europe is in the geographical origins of these humanoid humanoid folks. They no longer originate in the exotic lands of Asia or Africa. They are now very much a race of humanoids indigenous to mainland Europe and parts of Britain. For example, in the Arthurian romances, we find mentions of dog-headed people who are called Sinbins, Kinbins, and quite a nefarious bunch who Arthur's men would often find themselves embroiled in battles within the mountains of Aden or Edinburgh. There is a cryptic implication that the martyr's Gwergi Gwarwalid was one of these dogheads. His first name can be translated as a literal man-dog, and many scholars have identified him as either a Sinbin or a lycanthrope of sorts. Monk historian Paul makes an interesting observation regarding the cynocephaly in his Historia Gentis Langobardora. He says that it was a classic case of fear-mongering and mass hysteria, a myth developed to dismantle and shake the enemy forces from within to clamp their spirit before even the battle begins. They would spread rumors that they have in their camps a regiment of vicious dogheads who thrive on war and enjoy human blood and flesh as spoils of war in taverns, pubs, and salons. The Nordics and the Vikings were often attributed with such un-Christian and non-human qualities. The Berserkers, the most feared warrior class of warriors, matched the description in many ways. They would frequently appear cloaked in the fur of bears and wolves and display feats of extreme rage and frenzy on the battlefield. Cynocephalics and St. Christopher. The most pronounced of tales of epic grandeur and redemption in traditions of Christian myths and legends feature a cynocephalic. We are talking about the martyr St. Christopher who carried Christ on his back through a perilous stream. Legend has it that a few centuries after the death of Christ, during the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, there lived a man named Reprobus, who was captured in a battle against the Roman forces fought at Cyrenaica, a land of tribe dwellers to the west of Egypt. Besides being barbarous and unpleasant, he also had a towering frame that rose to somewhere between 7 and 12 feet tall, depending on the sources. It is said that because of his gigantic physique and size, he was uncompromising and irreverent towards God or religion as the supreme authority. He sought only to serve the mightiest person on the earth, who he thought to be the Canaanite king for a while. However, upon learning that the king would make the sign of the cross whenever the devil was mentioned, he thought Satan must be the most powerful being on earth, and so he sought out the devil and began serving under his command. However, he had a change of heart when he and his new master came across a cross, and the devil was terrified of it. The devil declared that the sign of Christ terrified him, and he felt overwhelmed with a rush of fear. Reprobus, at the moment, knew he had to seek out this Christ who makes even the devil cower in fear. He came across a hermit who taught him about this powerful God all that he needed to know. In order for Reprobus to be granted admittance in the good graces of Christ, the hermit recommended that he use his immense size to escort the weak and the vulnerable across a dangerous local river. One day, as Reprobus went about his business of assisting people as usual, a small child asked him to ferry him across the river. Reprobus lifted the child over his shoulders and began to cross. As he moved forward, the child grew heavier and heavier until it was him who was now in danger of drowning. He cried out, "O child, how heavy thou art! It seems I bear the entire weight of the world on my shoulders." And the child, in response, said, "Right thou art. Thou bearest not only the world but the creator of heaven and earth. I am Jesus Christ, the King and Lord, and henceforth thou shalt be called Christophorus, the one who bears Christ." He would then go on to convert entire cities for the Lord's cause before being martyred sometime around the 14th century. It is intriguing to note that not only was he portrayed as a giant, but a cynocephalic. Some sources mention that his cynocephaly, or a feral appearance, was a result of his conversion, while others state him to be a barbarous, flesh-eating, dog-headed humanoid who, after converting, was blessed with a gift of speech and a human demeanor. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, the icon of St. Christopher is portrayed in the image of a dog head. The icon was prescribed in the 18th century by Moscow, which is why the depiction is contested and met with hostility by the Orthodox Church. Cynocephalics in pop culture. Over the years, with the emergence of film, television media, and games, the trope of anthropomorphic creatures and beings has become a staple in the genres of fantasy fiction and games. In this day and age, the cynocephalic is not so much a legend or a myth cautioning us from venturing into uncharted terrains, but an archetype to explore possibilities and depths that surpass and transcend the scope of humanity, or as a metaphor for primal and uncontrollable forces beyond our control. A confrontation with society's fears of the other. For instance, in anime and manga, there are many instances where cynocephalic characters or behaviors are present in series like Naruto, Dragon Ball, and the Dog King. Perhaps the most prominent among these examples would be the character of Anubis Kruger, the Shadow Ranger from SPD, who is a dog-headed humanoid character and a mentor to the young Rangers trained in combat. Kruger is the commander of the SPD and is known for unwavering loyalty and commitment to his duty and responsibility as a leader. He is a favorite among fans of the Power Rangers franchise. Cynocephalics in Cryptozoology. In Cryptozoology, these creatures are among the most fascinating and have recurred on occasion throughout the annals of history since ancient times till as late as the early 20th century. The most recent sighting before the 20th century was when Columbus arrived at the Caribbean islands. He had stories of a group of natives known as Canina or Caniba. They had heads with what appeared to be just one eye on the forehead. These creatures would feed upon the flesh of humans. In his later works, however, Columbus flouted his previous claims as he admittedly stated that he had never encountered such creatures in his life. However, a few centuries later, as humanity had transitioned to a more rational and urban way of living, there began to surface talks of a large humanoid canine cryptid in the city of Elkhorn, Wisconsin. It was described as a humongous wolf-like creature, feral in nature, that is capable of both bipedal and quadrupedal walking. It was often referred to as the Beast of Bray Road among the townsfolk. In the 1990s, a reporter named Linda Godfrey investigated this legend and went on to author the book The Beast of Bray Road, telling Wisconsin's werewolf. However, the title is a misnomer, as the beast wasn't a werewolf in the sense that it didn't possess the ability to shapeshift and had no human form. Other similar legends. There are parallels to cynocephalics for as far back as recorded history goes. They were just one among many to have caught the notice of ancient historians and travelers. For instance, in Slavic folklore, we get the Soglovs, who are essentially a race of chthonic beings or creatures or forces that inhabit the underworld. They had the legs of a horse, teeth made of iron, a canid head with a solitaire eye protruding at the center, above the nasal line, and the body of a humanoid. They fed on the dead and would dig up corpses of humans from their graves. They are mostly believed to dwell in dubious caves bereft of light. However, their primary terrain is described as an eternally dark land. The soil is rich in exquisite gemstones. Another in this regard would be the Itbaraks, as they were female cynocephalics that Ibn Battuta and John Mandeville came across in Asia. Some sources suggest that these canid humanoids would mate regularly with the legendary Amazon tribes, and that the offsprings, if they were female, would be taken and raised by the Amazons, whereas the males or the dog-headed ones would grow in the care of the cynocephaly. Marvelous verdict. We are not in the spirit as we once were. While some of these accounts may seem baffling or even ludicrous to us, it is important to bear in mind that stories and myths galore, where reason and resources fail, are a sign of our obvious lack of depth or limitation as a species. Stories like these, when they resurface, really urge us to consider the possibility that if we are the supreme race of beings, they burst our bubble to inquire and seek inwards, rather than beyond to assess our instincts, to confront our worst fears and the power of imagination. We are as we imagine ourselves to be. More importantly, is there a bigger picture, or are we looking at a chapter lost in the folds of time in the grand narrative of Earth? Possibly a species that we shared our history and learnings with? What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.